Welcome to the most interesting and actionable part of the TOGAF ADM, and that is the part that covers ADM guidelines and techniques. So we talked about the ADM in many respects. We talked about the objectives of each phase. We also talked about how to scope, how to govern. Now we need to talk about how to adapt in a little more detail. And then we have some techniques that show how to accomplish certain tasks within the ADM. So it's very useful information. It's not all original to TOGAF, but we're bringing in some very effective practices to help us make the changes required to go from baseline to target, in effect, through the ADM with these adaptations of guidelines and techniques. So these are part 3 of TOGAF. Part 2 of TOGAF is the ADM, which is a step-by-step routing through the different phases. And then part 3 of TOGAF, we have the guidelines and techniques. So the purpose of this lesson is to help you understand and master these guidelines and techniques. So included in these techniques are going to be architecture principles, and we'll provide some ideas on how to have a standard template, fill out a standard template for doing architecture principles. What are some of the guidelines for what makes up a good architecture principle? We'll also cover a business scenario and how we can use those to help clarify requirements in the ADM. We'll then talk about gap analysis, how to do the gap analysis technique, which we indicated was so important for phases B, C, and D, that we needed to do a gap analysis in order to find out what's it going to take to get from where we're at to where we need to go, as we then select solutions in phases E and F to move toward our vision from phase A. So we actually have a gap analysis technique that we're going to describe. Then a type of a gap analysis, but it's not the gap analysis technique per se, but a type of a gap analysis is interoperability. What interoperability do we need versus what interoperability do we have? And what are we going to do to address that gap? So we're going to talk about interoperability requirements gathering. Then how ready are we to transform versus how ready do we need to be to transform? So we have the business transformation readiness assessment technique, sometimes affectionately called the BTRA for short, business transformation readiness assessment. So again, that's another type of a gap analysis, unofficially, because what's the gap in our readiness? We're going to look at that and how it links to risk management. So risk management is clearly tied to a lack of readiness. But what helps us with the BTRA is says lack of readiness where? Do you lack money? Do you lack vision? Do you lack a sponsor? So there is a close relationship between the BTRA and the risk management techniques, because one helps to highlight where in fact we may have risk if we don't do something about our lack of readiness. There are a couple of techniques that are fundamental to thinking in TOGAF. One is capability-based planning, and that's where anything that we decide on as an incremental solution should be traced back to what is the new or enhanced business capability that has been asked for, either through a strategic plan or some kind of a strategy document or performance plan. But we need to trace incremental delivery of capability back to a business imperative. That's capability-based planning. So it's a technique, but it's more a way of thinking that's so fundamental to the ADM, TOGAF ADM. So talking about adapting the ADM process overall, we did mention how that is possible in TOGAF and almost necessary to modify the ADM. But when we talk about the term guidelines in TOGAF, guidelines for adapting the ADM. So in part 3 of TOGAF, we have guidelines and techniques. Guidelines for adapting the ADM. So that's a more complete exposition there of what that term means, guidelines. Guidelines for adapting the ADM. And then techniques are for accomplishing specific tasks within the ADM, or as I just explained with capability-based planning, is a way of thinking. So the guidelines part of the TOGAF 9.1 specification specifically mentions iteration and then partitioning across the architecture landscape. It mentions security architecture adaptations of inputs and outputs, and it mentions how could I apply ADM in light of taking a service-oriented architecture approach. So those are explicitly laid out, but there are really infinite possibilities because everyone needs to figure out how they're going to adapt any particular area of change to their particular organization or part of their organization. So it's a pretty wide open area for guidelines, and again all of it deals with the particulars of your organization, of your EA team. Techniques, on the other hand, are much more straightforward. There are specific tasks that can be supported within the ADM. So if we want to come up with architecture principles, we can do that. And there's a chapter for each of the key techniques in TOGAF. There's a separate chapter. There are a few techniques that support migration planning, and those are their own chapter. But what I'm going to cover first are the key ones that each have their own chapter in part 3 of TOGAF. Architecture principles, I think, are one of the most important elements for having an effective architecture practice, and it's a key part of the ADM. In preliminary phases to set up your architecture principles, and then in phase A and subsequently to confirm those architecture principles and perhaps elaborate them in some way. So architecture principles describe how to develop the set of general rules and guidelines for the architecture initiative that you're developing, or for your overarching EA approach. Talk more about that in a moment. The second one that is extremely important for all architects to master is stakeholder management. Stakeholder management is an important discipline that successful architecture practitioners can use to win support for their projects. So you say you're going to do a transformation. You say, who would be concerned about this transformation? What kind of concerns would they have? And how can I address those concerns so I can win their support? And even if they're not supportive, how can I communicate with them so that they won't undermine my effort? So stakeholder management is extremely important, as well as architecture principles. I mentioned briefly architecture patterns earlier as one of the key techniques. That it's kind of like capability-based planning, and that is basically descriptive in nature. Architecture patterns provide guidance on using particular approaches to solve a problem in a repeatable way. So again, once I sort out what are all the building blocks to do smartphones for hotel keys, what are all the capabilities needed, and what are all the solutions I've decided to use, and all the standards, well, I could define that as an architecture pattern. So make that available to people so that they wouldn't have to figure out how to solve this problem over and over again. So just as capability-based planning is somewhat definitional, architecture patterns somewhat definitional. It's how I combine building blocks to have a reusable approach to a common problem or opportunity. The business scenarios are very important up front, especially in the ADM, because they help you to define your high-level requirements for what could be your phase A, your architecture vision. what success would look like, how could you proceed with the work, and what particular aspects of the business architecture would be changing and how they need to be supported. So business scenarios are really great because they allow you to consider your objectives, of course, but also both the architecture building blocks and the solution building blocks that may be needed to solve the problem. And you could bring in experts and different folks from different domains and leaders and sponsors up front there for these type of workshops to help you gain insights as to what really makes sense for one or more phase A's for success. So in fact, the business scenario is a method for deriving business requirements for architecture, as well as the implied technical requirements and also what success would look like. For the other one, the overarching one that comes into play for our BCD work and feeds into E is gap analysis, as you recall. We're trying to say, what is our gap analysis between our baseline and target in our business architecture, data, application, and technology architecture space, and how would we collect all those gaps and move them into phase E to come up with consolidated approaches for work packages. So the gap analysis technique is extremely popular and essential in TOGAF because so much of what we're doing is in fact involves some kind of gap analysis, but there is a specialized gap analysis technique for phases B, C, D, and then feeding into phase E. And then, as I said earlier, we have 5 migration planning techniques that help us in phases E and F. So there's one chapter on those 5 techniques. All the other techniques that we're talking about, they each have their own chapter in part 3 of TOGAF. Okay. So for interoperability requirements, that's a technique that I said it's kind of like a gap analysis, but it's tied specifically to the topic of interoperability. So what interoperability do we need versus what interoperability do we have, looking at each phase, phases A to F. Like in phase A, we want to do a smart hotel. However, is that really interoperable with the demographics of our hotel business? So we would have some issues with the visioning of a smart hotel there if we're not careful. In the same way, when we look in phase B, we have to think about the people, the processes, the services and functions, and saying, well, does this smart hotel thing really work across our whole business, or would we have to build a new chain of hotels for a smart hotel? So you have to adjust your thinking in light of interoperability for business domain, but then also you're saying we want to use all these apps, and you're going, well, for phase C, you're saying, okay, well, apps and data, but where am I getting that data for what kind of apps, and how will that work with our existing applications in terms of what data we're using now and what format it's in? So then you move into D, you're saying, okay, what are the what's the interoperability now for our networking, and what will it need to be to support these new information flow requirements? And then business transformation readiness assessment, we covered briefly, the BTRA. It helps us identify business transformation issues and in light of several basic notional factors like, do you have a vision, do you have money, do you have a sponsor, are you going to be able to really run this thing when this new project, when it lands into production? So you use that type of approach to gather potential gaps in readiness so that you can identify risk, which leads us to the other technique, risk management, a technique for managing risk during an architecture/business transformation project. And capability-based planning we talked about before. Okay, so I've covered guidelines and techniques in an introductory fashion. In the next section, we're going to go into a little more detail on each one.